Welcome to this community session for the contributors for Backstage. We have a lot of things to cover today. I'm totally excited that we have two presentations. One of the authorization framework by Joe from Spotify, one from Roadie. Brian Fletcher is joining us to share about the scaffolder feature and the efforts they did. We will, of course, go over any questions in the chat and in the issue. But first, it is time, as usual, for the maintainer update.
It's not super exciting yet, but we're looking at shipping, eventually some form of 1.0 or stable version of the project. There's an RFC up that's kind of discussing our versioning policy. Just wanted to shout out that we'll probably switch up the release process a little bit. So don't be too surprised if all of a sudden releases are called some number instead of the current database tag that we're using currently. And some updates to tooling and so on around that as well at the same time. But that's basically what we got to share for now.
Okay, thank you very much for jumping on the call. The link, as you might expect, is in the chat, and we will link it under the YouTube video if you're watching this back later. So the next person in the house is Joe, and Joe wants to share some work that has been going on, or the results of that work actually, of the authorization framework. And I heard that there was a demo even. Joe, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Yes, that's true. So I can introduce myself quick. Joe, I'm an engineer at Spotify based in New York. Been working on Backstage for about 6 or 7 months now. So today I wanted to give an update on the auth framework, show how to set it up for your Backstage app, and do a demo on how you might write a policy to define your authorization roles. So let me just share my screen real quick. Okay. So you should be able to see my screen now. All right. So yep, as I said, I'll do an overview and provide a demo. So I have a couple slides just to introduce the framework. So why did we implement this authorization framework? Backstage has a bunch of ways to authenticate into the app through all the different auth providers. So we have Google, GitHub. So we have a way of telling Backstage who you are, but there hasn't been a way to use this identity to decide what you have access to and what actions you can take in the app. So this has been a blocker for some adopters. It's been a highly requested feature from the community. And one of the things that we wanted to account for is Backstage's flexibility, which we think is its superpower. So we want this framework to be open for extension. We don't want to tie adopters down to a specific approach to authorization like RBAC or ABAC. So what is it? So the framework uses a model where all of your rules are defined in one centralized place. We're calling that place the authorization policy. So this policy is flexible. So it's just an async function. It takes a permission and a user and returns some decision. So because it's async, you can do whatever you need to do in there. You can call to an external system. You can read from the database, whatever you need to make that authorization decision. It's also democratized, so plugin authors can integrate support for this on their own without updating the Backstage core. Adopters can add their own permissions and integrate them separately. So it's we don't need to iterate on this one piece. We can really build it all in independent locations. All right, so I'll jump over to the demo now. So I already have Backstage running. So just to provide some context on what I've done to set up the app so far. So I ran the Backstage create app script using Postgres as the database. I created a catalog entity for myself and added myself to team A. And I've also configured the GitHub sign-in provider and implemented a sign-in resolver to add some ownership claims to my authorization token. So the ownership claim is just saying that I have a claim to my user entity and the group that I'm a member of, just to map that to the right catalog entities. All right, so this should look familiar. This is just the catalog landing page. I can see all the components, even the components that I don't own. I can click into a component that I don't own, and I can even go up and unregister it. So I'll do that to demonstrate. So we actually, I'm going to show like what it would look like to restrict that behavior a little bit more. So maybe we don't want to give the capability to everybody to unregister a component. So let's go through the process to setting that up. So I'm going to jump into VS Code. And we're going to start in the app config. So the first thing you need to do is turn on the authorization framework. So you do that by setting the permission enabled flag to true. And this is just telling the framework to start sending authorization requests. Right now, we skip the auth requests sort of as an optimization for anybody who doesn't want to use it, and also while we iterate on this, and it's not enabled by default. Next thing you need to do is uncomment these lines for the backend auth keys. So this enables backend to backend auth, which is a prerequisite for the permission framework. This is a way for backends to identify themselves to other backends, which is necessary so the auth framework knows when a request is coming from a user versus from a server. So you can imagine like the catalog ingestion process that needs some advanced capabilities, we don't want to restrict it based on the auth rules in our policy. So it'll use a server token for that. Okay, so that should be it for the app config. The next thing I'm going to do is change into the backend package. And I'm going to add the plugin permission backend. So this is the new backend plugin that will handle all of these authorization requests from other backend plugins and from the front end app. So while I'm installing that, I'll go over and start creating the new module for the permission plugin. And this has already been integrated with the example app in the main Backstage repo. So I'm just going to go and take that code and copy it in as a starting point. So the policy in this example is just implemented inline. You could do this in a separate package and import it. It just needs to be some function or class that you plug into the policy parameter to the create router call. So this is called allow all permission policy because that's what it does. But we're going to make some changes to that. So I'll rename it here. I'll just call it demo policy. And because this doesn't use any of the parameters yet, I'm just going to, the parameters to the handle function, I'm just going to delete that and let the editor fill those in for me. So as you can see, we for this handle function, we take a request, which is a policy authorized query. This contains that permission and some information about what the user is trying to do. And it also takes a user object, which is a Backstage identity response, and that has the user's auth token and their claims. This also needs to be an async function. So I mentioned that I wanted to restrict the behavior of the unregister capability. So in order to do that, we're going to look at what permission is being requested. So we'll look at request.permission.name. And when name equals catalog entity delete, which is the permission that we've created to represent this unregister action, then we're going to return a decision, which just has a result of deny. And since this policy is only handling the delete case, we want to have a fallback to cover everything else. So we'll keep that allowed by default behavior. All right, so at this point, the policy should deny any action to delete catalog entities, and it should allow everything else. So I'll change back up to my root directory, and I'll start the app again. Oh, no, I actually did forget a couple other steps. So we created the permission module, but we need to wire that up with our backend app router. So we'll jump over to the backend index file. And just like the other plugins, we'll import it. And we'll create the environment for it. And then we'll connect it to the router. And there's one other thing we have to do in this file. I mentioned while I was updating the app config that we need to enable backend to backend auth. And one of the steps to doing that is to replace the no-op server token manager to the default implementation. So there's just a factory method for that. So you can say server token manager from config, and then we can just pass in our logger there. So that should be all I need to do to get this working here. Might just need to sign out and sign back in. All right, so this should look the same, but we want to make sure that the disable capability or unregister capability is no longer available. So as you can see, the button is now disabled. Just to show, so this is team A. I'll go to another one that is owned by a different user, and that is disabled there as well. So that's great. We've blocked that action, but that wasn't exactly what we were trying to do, because now no user can unregister a component. But what we wanted to do was actually disable this capability unless you're the owner of the component. So let's go back into the policy and show how to do that. So you've seen the allow result and the deny result, and we have one more type, which is called a conditional. So a conditional decision is a way of deferring the evaluation back to the plugin that owns that permission. So this is a way of supporting use cases where we don't have all the information necessary in the policy, and we want to let the plugin take the rules that we've defined and apply them itself. So in this case, we can't really figure out if the requesting user is an owner of the entity that they're trying to act on. So we'll build a conditional decision to represent that. So we have some helpers to do this. So one of them is called create catalog policy decision. And this helper is kind of just an abstraction, and it'll produce the conditional results object for you. You could also do that by hand, but these helpers are nice because it kind of hides the internals of this and lets us iterate on them without needing to make too many breaking changes. It's also a little bit easier to write these out using the helpers. So we're doing a conditional decision, and there's one other helper that I'll import, and that's called catalog conditions. So catalog conditions is an object that defines all of the conditions that the catalog plugin supports. So as you can see, we can use conditions based on whether an entity has an annotation, whether it has a label, some metadata, if it's a certain entity kind. And in this case, we're going to want to use the is entity owner condition. And this condition needs one parameter, and that's a list of claims. So it needs to know who the user is in order to figure out if they're the owner of the entity. So we'll just pass in the ownership entity claims from the user object. And since users can be anonymous, we just need to provide a fallback. So we'll just do an empty array. So that's saying that if a user is logged in, we'll provide their ownership entity refs and use those to determine if they're the owner. Otherwise, it'll be empty and they won't match to any entities. All right, so I will jump back to the app here. I'll refresh. And let's go into a component that I own. So you can see now that the unregister action is enabled, and I can do this for owned components. I'll go back to a component that I don't own, and it's disabled. So hopefully that demonstrates sort of the flexibility in these conditional decisions. But let's layer on some additional logic. So I've restricted that certain action, but what about like visibility? So right now I can see all the components that I own, and I can see components that I don't own. But if I'm in an organization that is a little bit more restrictive and I only want people to see what they own, then I might want to set up a filter to do that, or auth rule to do that. So I'll jump back to the policy, and I will add another block here. And we will check for the read permission this time. So since we're using the same rules, I'll just copy this conditional decision down to this block, and I'll save. So now we should be doing the same thing for deleting entities and reading entities. So going back to the app, I'll refresh. And now I can only see the components that I own. So that was very helpful. But as you can see, I've enumerated both of these permissions, and you can see how this might like grow as you want to support more of these catalog permissions. It might not scale that well. So one way that you can simplify this is to combine these two blocks into a single check against what's called a resource type. So the framework provides a way for permissions to define an associated resource type. So in the case of catalog permissions, the associated resource is always a catalog entity. So what we can do here is check if the request permissions resource type is catalog entity. And if it is, we'll just use that same logic to restrict the action to owners only. And we can delete these two blocks now that we have one consolidated rule for this. And another benefit here is that this will apply to any permission that's using the catalog entity as its resource type. So this might scale a little better as you bring in new plugins that are using the catalog as a resource, or if new permissions get added to the catalog, they should be ready to go with this policy. Just to tie things back together, I'll go back and refresh to show that this still behaves as expected. Cool. So that was all I wanted to show for the policy demo. I guess just to wrap things up, we're still working on integrating the framework with some of the core plugins. Catalog is mostly done, and tech docs is set up, and search is still in progress. And our main focus coming up is to get the documentation in a good place so that everybody else can start implementing this for production. But as you saw, I actually did all of this off of the create app. So all of this code is on master right now. So if you're interested, you can play around with this stuff. We would love to hear your thoughts. If you have use cases that you don't think are supported, that's especially useful. We want to make sure that this can work for everybody. So please try this out. Let us know what you think. follow up on the new Discord channel called Permissions, which we just created. So if you have any follow-up questions, that would be the place to go. Just one other note, I guess, if you are going to try this out, we don't recommend using this in production yet, just because the documentation isn't fully there yet, and we're still making some changes. So it's probably better to try this out locally, doing a little experiment and providing feedback that way. But yeah, that's it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Joe, for jumping on this call and sharing this with us. It looks really promising already. Well, you already explained the status of the work being done and it being like implemented in the other core functionalities. So what is next is the documentation, but you already wanted to share something. So to the folks watching who are maintaining, for instance, a plugin, what do they need to do right now?
Yeah, I would say for plugin authors, definitely look at the packages that we have available. Check out the catalog plugin, particularly the catalog backend. You can see some examples of how the framework is being integrated there. Another place, there's some open PRs for integration and search. And then if you're curious about how TechDocs works, you can look at the code there. That takes kind of an interesting approach where it implicitly uses authorization by loading entities from the catalog. So by default, you're using catalog-based permissions for TechDocs. But definitely check out the new code that's available and let us know how it's going.
Next up, we have another presentation, and that's Brian from Roadie. Brian, are you there?
I am here.
Great, welcome. So you wanted to share something on the work you did to support the scaffolder feature, right?
That's true. Will I kick off?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. I'm not going to talk Joe's presentation. That was amazing. We're really excited in Roadie about the authorization. So we were loving the presentation and asked loads of questions. So hopefully I can entertain you guys at least part of the way to Joe's presentation. Right, so I'm going to share my screen for a moment. Can you see my presentation here?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so I've met, I'd say a small proportion of you guys before in this meetup, but my name's Brian. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm working for a company called Roadie, and I'm a software engineer there. So we did a bit of work in the last couple of months to support the scaffolder feature in Roadie. So I just wanted to go through what we did there to support it, and maybe some of the changes that we, with the collaboration of the core team, provided to the upstream projects in order for us to be able to implement the scaffolder. And we're extremely grateful for that. Right, so I'll go through why we did it in the first place, what we did, and how we did it. So kicking off, so you might be familiar with Roadie, but if you're not, we're a SaaS product. So we provide Backstage basically as a service to our customers. So by the nature of a SaaS service, we basically have shared resources in some form or another across our platform. So some examples are, we share networks between our customers, we share load balancers, we share Kubernetes clusters, and various other shared services across the platform. So for that reason, like whenever we deploy features to Backstage in the Roadie platform, we need to be like extremely careful that, that there's no chance that a customer or a user in a customer can escalate their privileges beyond their own scope. So for the scaffolder feature, we wanted to create a more constrained environment for the individual tasks to run. That would like ultimately make it more secure, and sort of, it's not really a use case for, like, we weren't motivated by making it more scalable, but because we're deploying it in a particular way, it's basically almost infinitely scalable. So moving on to the next slide. So the scaffolder, if you run the scaffolder out of the box, by default, it runs on the Backstage backend in the same process. So for that reason, like the tasks are actually running with the same privileges as Backstage in the same context, on the same networks, on the same, you know, basically the same environment as the Backstage backend. So if an individual task is compromised, it basically has the same scope as the Backstage backend, and all of the, you know, file system access and all of the network access that the backend would have. So we wanted to make that a little bit more constrained. So what we did to do that was we basically like made a couple of the interfaces in the Backstage project public. So one of them is the broker, the scaffolder broker, if you're familiar with that, and the task store, and a bunch of the different supporting elements around the task store and the task broker, so that we could implement them ourselves to provide the feature. And I mean, I worked extremely closely with the core team, and I would say they mostly led me the way there. But yeah, so we basically expose them as public interfaces, so anyone can implement them, and there's default implementations of those available, and that's how the scaffolder currently works in the Backstage project. And then we implemented our own task queue or task broker, and the task broker basically publishes to an external queue, and the purpose of that is so that we can actually run the scaffolder tasks outside of the Backstage backend. So basically we have like a separate system that's subscribing to that queue that's being published to by the backend, and then the external task worker can interact with that queue in order to determine what task to run, and they can run the task outside of it. Okay, so the public interfaces that were exposed were the task broker. So it's got three functions: claim, dispatch, and observe. So claim is taking a task that hasn't been started and returning it. Dispatch is taking a request from the API and dispatching the request to be performed, I suppose. And then observe, watching a task. So the storage task broker, that's the default implementation in Backstage. It's writing a task to the database. At least when the last time I looked, that's what it's doing. And when a task is claimed, it takes either the most recent one or the least recent task and returns it to the whatever the task worker. We've just implemented this like internally, custom SQS task broker, and it basically acts the same as the task broker. It still writes the route to the database, but it also enqueues a message on SQS containing information about the task that the user wants to run, which then allows our framework to go off and do whatever it needs to do in order to run the task. This storage task broker has also been made public, and we have implemented one additional function on this. So because our task scheduler is like, because we're enqueuing each individual task to the task queue, the external task queue, the scheduler wants to start a task worker for a specific task. So we need to be able to claim a task by its ID instead of claiming a task by its most, I think, I can't remember exactly, I'd need to look at the algorithm again, but it either takes the most recent or the least recent, but that's not good enough for us. We just want to run the exact task that needs to be run. So we've implemented an additional function onto this custom storage task broker, which we've implemented internally as well, called claim task by ID. And then we implemented this class on the left-hand side, scaffolder task worker. It's effectively a CLI application with a main function. Its inputs are basically its environment, and takes task ID, the database host, and the base URL. And these are just used to generate an app config, basically a like much pared down version of the app config that you would see in the Backstage repository or whatever on a scaffolded app. So the base URL is to configure the discovery processor. So the tasks will need to be able to perform operations against the public API. So we're giving it the base URL. And if it needs to connect to the public API, it has to use the token that it has, that the task has in order to contact the API. So it's able to authenticate against it via its public endpoint. And we're using the database host, so it needs to know what database it needs to connect to for that particular tenant. And it's using IAM or DS credentials to connect to the database so that it doesn't need to have the actual username and password. So if there's any sort of compromise there, the database credentials should expire, after some time. And then the task ID itself to actually run the task, so it knows which task to run. And then it has a reference to the storage broker and the task broker. So these are the custom implementations that we've provided. So it claims a specific task by ID, and then it has the task broker so that it can write the state back. And basically a main function to actually run the thing. So when it starts up, it attempts to retrieve the task ID, claims the task, and then executes the task, and then writes the state back to the database. Okay, so this is what it looks like from a sequence diagram perspective. So the left-hand side here is just it looks to the user exactly like the current scaffolder feature looks to in Roadie. Like it doesn't look any different to the user. So that's all the green stuff here on the left. The black stuff on the right is our infrastructure to support this, and the red stuff are changes that we've made to Backstage in order to support what we've done in our infrastructure. So a user will come along and start a task that'll store the task details into the Backstage database. That's all normal. And then we've implemented the task broker, like I mentioned earlier on, which is dispatching a task to an SQS queue. Then we have a Lambda, which is triggered. So this is all our infrastructure is in AWS, and we've implemented an AWS Lambda function, which is triggered off an SQS queue. That scheduler is authenticating the message, so it's basically making sure that the source of this message that that's triggered it is from a tenant to start with. So all of our Backstage instances have their own identity, so we know if it tries to connect to another service within our infrastructure, which tenant has actually executed it. So we're basically authenticating the message, and then we're able to instantiate an ECS container within a more constrained environment. So this ECS container has a particular role for a tenant. It has particular network access, like it's only able to connect to its database and the public internet, and probably other things that I'm not thinking of right now. But basically, we're able to, we're able to constrain this as tightly as we need to, so that the task can get its work done. But it also is limited by, whatever infrastructure we can. It's configuring some map config, and then it's getting the task from the database, executing the task, and then committing the changes back to the database. And then the user is seeing the task in progress, and the user can see the task complete. So that's the same on the left-hand side. Right, so nearly finished. Right, so improvements that we want to make to this. So the scaffolder task worker is quite a large Docker container. So the scaffolder task worker is about 800 megabytes, I think. So it's building the whole Backstage backend in order to support the single executable to run the task. So we'd like to be able to pare that down. Effectively, the scaffolder task worker is a new package that we've created in our scaffolder app. So in order to build it, we have to build it with the whole package. We might be able to do some optimizations there, but basically that means that because it's so large, if the Docker host has not got that image downloaded yet, it can take 2 minutes odd to download the thing, unpack it, and then execute the task, which is just too long because someone's just looking at waiting for logs for 2 minutes. And you can think of kind of optimizations that you could do there, pre-cache the image, make it smaller, all of those kind of things. So we want to kind of do things like that. But once it's warm, I think it takes about 15 seconds to start. And then the other one is we would prefer, if it was possible, that the task worker would not need connectivity directly to the database. So if we were able to, you know, either use the broker or some other interface to like write the state back to another queue, and that would mean that the task worker would be even further isolated. It wouldn't even need to connect to its own database, because you know, we've actually, I didn't mention this earlier on, but up here, this ECS container only has access to the scaffolder database. It doesn't have access to the catalog database, for example. So, but to even further constrain it, you would just not give it connectivity to the database whatsoever. And that would be nice if we could do that. So basically, we created a more constrained environment for the tasks to run in. We think it's a little bit more secure, and we think it's a more scalable infrastructure for the tasks. And that concludes my presentation. I wonder, does anyone have any questions?
Okay, I take it there's no questions, but I think people can find you on Discord.
That's true, yes, they can. I think I'm under Brian Fletcher or something very similar.
Okay, so please shout out, and otherwise just mention Roadie. And
I'll put my handle on this chat.
Yeah,
on Discord, for Discord.
Good, good, good. Thank you. So let's go over the issue. I'm gonna refresh it if there's anything added, or if you have a question right now for somebody on the call. This is your moment.
The kind of timeline for 1.0, do we know when the 1.0 release is? Just like vaguely, it doesn't need to be anything specific, just kind of ballpark when we think it's going to be going out or happening.
I can take this if you want. The 1.0 release of Backstage, you mean?
Yep.
Okay, so we have so I mean, first of all, we are targeting the Q1. So, but again, it will be the end of Q1. Honestly, in the middle of March, there is an amazing Backstage anniversary that we would like to, I mean, target. But again, you should expect this for the end of the Q1, around that period of time, if it makes sense.
Sounds good. Awesome.
And this is also the moment, Francesco, to pitch your updated roadmap, or your updated roadmap, the updated roadmap.
Okay. Do you mean to pitch again the thing that we did last week?
Yes, because some folks might have not been there in the other call.
Perfect. So we managed to get new version of the roadmap. You can find this as part of the official documentation, more in particular in the page dedicated to the roadmap. As part of this page that we are also working, I mean, to put in a better and more clear version, because it is enough clear, but we have some suggestion on how to improve it. What you can find as part of the new version of the roadmap is two sections as usual. So what is going to happen next? And next means as part of this quarter, so January, February, and March. And what is part of the future work? As part of the what's next, we are already working on it. And honestly, Patrick before was sharing also a very interesting and a relevant milestone in defining the versioning policy for the incoming major version of Backstage. And instead, the future work is more targeting what it is on our radar, but we are not committed yet to work on. So let me say, this is exactly the future work. It's something that is the right moment to plan and discuss if you have any idea of contributing, for example, or if you have an idea for the medium and long-term plan around Backstage. Without further ado, let me highlight what is currently in the next section. Most in particular, there is the Backstage 1.0 version. So as part of the this major release, we plan to ship, of course, the core services and plugins, entities, components of the platform. You can find further details here. The team is working hard already in packaging the things, the releases in a way that are fits for that purpose and for that goal. We already discussed also about some kind of date and target date, even if it's not explicitly declared here. But again, what we would like to do as a gift to all of us and to all of you guys is to take a very nice excuse. That is the middle of March, when we have the Spotify anniversary. So what would be best to use this date here? We are also working with the CNCF about auditing Backstage from a security perspective. We are moving further our steps to work with a third-party company to audit Backstage and check if there are vulnerabilities, and of course with the purpose to fix them. We know that this is only the first of a series of initiatives that we should take to make Backstage also more suitable for core service and mission critical use cases and environments. We have in the future work also a session dedicated to provide a more extensive security strategy, security plan and security strategy for Backstage. For this quarter, what we are planning to do is a first security auditing, of course, with a commitment to identify at least if there are vulnerability across what we are already doing, because there are already in place professional initiative to make Backstage secure. Last but not least, let me quote something that is absolutely relevant for all of us. It is about moving another step ahead on the incubation stage as part of the CNCF ecosystem. What you can see here, it's a GitHub issue as part of the CNCF repository, where you can monitor and see the progress of the promotion that we are doing to move Backstage that is currently in sandbox stage to the incubation stage. This this action here would unblock a lot of services that are also suitable for the entire community, and it would be amazing. Let me say, I can provide further details, but I don't want to bother you too much, and I'm always available to meet and discuss through all of this. As you know, we have the opportunity to meet a slot, to book a slot with the Backstage team to discuss about the roadmap, tips and tricks to start with Backstage and on board with Backstage, maybe also technical sessions and things like that. Talking about what we have in our radar but not already planned, let me highlight an initiative from the engineering to the couple, the front-end services and the back-end services to have more scalability and maintainability. We already mentioned the security plan. Search will be part, Search 1.0 will be shipped after this quarter, is not part of the initial Backstage 1.0 release. We have also other initiative around the tech docs and the framework and the composability around the homepage. I know that there are lots of conversation in the community around GraphQL support. This is absolutely on our radar. Telemetry is something that it is absolutely a hot topic for everyone. This is something that we are monitoring. We would like to create a real plan for the near future, and of course improve the user experience, because we need to do better also on this side of things. Let me stop here, but again, this is only an update for this quarter. We would like to keep this page and for transparency also keep the communication open on what we plan to do for each quarter. I don't know if you have any question on the roadmap.
The question that I had was kind of follow up to that. The timeline is, when is a good time for us to start to present the work that we've done around GraphQL? Because I know there's a conversation around timing. Previously, it was like after we do 1.0. So should we hold off on the GraphQL like discussions until like end of March, which is perfectly fine. I just want to find out like what is a good time. So that we can prepare for those conversations, and also make sure that everyone knows that we do have things that would like to contribute.
Good question. Thank you, Taras. I think this is something that we can involve also the team, because as you can imagine, the team is very much focused on the goal for this quarter. But again, it's probably I can imagine that probably once we will land to the second part of the quarter, it's probably a little bit better to start having this conversation, because of course things will be clear from what we are currently doing. And of course the team will start to think about the future, but I don't know, someone from the core maintainers or from the team wants to suggest a different or confirm the approach?
It pretty much sounds good.
Agreed. All right, sounds good. Cool.
Maybe I don't know.
Works for us.
I think, Taras, that you have also ideas on how to start the conversation. Maybe one very fast conversation could be also what could be a first initiative to start the conversation. I don't know if it is maybe a conversation, one similar session, maybe in February session, or an RFC, or a conversation in Discord. I don't know. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I think we can do a demo. I think an RFC should come from this discussion that comes from the demo, because depending on like the pieces that we created might not be appropriate for Backstage 4. So I think it'd be good to get some direction on what what shape, like what is kind of feature set that a GraphQL integration should have, and then based on that we could put together a POC, and then from that POC create an RFC. That could be a good way to kind of go.
Amazing. It seems that you are already on it. Perfect.
Great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Can't wait to see that. Good. So I've been going over the issue. I do not see any new things there. One question which we will carry over to the adopters session. We will continue with the current cadence. So that is that at the third Wednesday of the month, we have the adopter session, and then the week after the contributor session. Please keep an eye out on the issue. We will close this one and we will create the new one swiftly, so you can put all the things you might want to discuss or questions you have in there. Join on Discord if you are not there already, and find us and discuss with everybody in the community. Yes, thank you so much for joining. And with this, we are closing this session. Oh, and don't forget, if you want to show something you've worked on, both for the adopter or the contributor session, please just let us know, put it in the issue. If you have any doubts, hit us up on Discord, because you don't need to have any doubts. You can show off what you have done, because we greatly appreciate it, especially live demos. No pressure.